So I was born into a faith of a long-standing religion whose creed was, I was never enough. Were you raised in that faith too? Enforced through old stories and sacred texts that I'd been taught as a child. And then as I aged, it seemed to be repeated in the echo of our culture, in classrooms and in offices, and then repeated again all the time by the forceful evangelism of marketing and the internet that whispered of scarcity and comparisons and want. Things like fear, doubt, or shame around old lessons or empty things taught by our culture can mold and contort us, and it can influence how we see and understand ourselves and others. When I was a newly ordained minister, I was invited to our UU headquarters in Boston. It was a gathering of all the new folks who had been accepted into UU ministry within that year. During the seminars, the leaders had us reflect on things that got in the way of our ministry. It led to deep sharing and confessions. In the tenderness of those confessions, we were then asked, what's your good news about your faith? What is it you want everyone to know? Well, I didn't even have to stop and think about that. I knew exactly what my good news was. It was something I shared with people almost every day in my work as a hospice chaplain. I raised my hand excitedly in my small group and I shared right away that I believe that we are all called to shine just as we are, hurting, bruised, brilliant, beautiful, worn, and unique, because I believe that we are all individual facets of the divine. Divinity, for me, being that interconnected energy of love that flows through all things. That belief held a deep and sturdy spot within my heart and mind, and it still does. I've said these words often whenever I speak from a pulpit. But on that day in Boston, as I shared my good news, I suddenly stopped because it hit me. In that moment, I did not believe that good news for myself. My old religion, my old belief that I was not enough, held strong. I sat there dumbfounded. Oprah, if she had been there, she would have called this an aha moment. It literally turned my world upside down for a while. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that perhaps that's why I felt so strongly about sharing this good news with others, is because I so desperately needed to believe it for myself. Holding that realization, I had to turn inward. And I asked myself, now what? I like to watch TED Talks. TED Talks are a global set of forums where experts in different fields share ideas that they feel are important. In 2010, Dr. Brene Brown, one of my teachers and someone I often turn to in my sermons, shared a talk about vulnerability. Maybe you've seen it, and if you haven't, you should. She's a researcher who studies shame and vulnerability. Now there's a job, right? She's a PhD and she is running towards the very things, shame and vulnerability, that most of us are trying to run away from. Her talk was transformative for me. While sharing personal stories that revealed her own fears and struggles, her honest and casual way of talking made it feel like she was talking directly to me. And if over 19 million views are any indication, I think a lot of other people felt that she was talking to them as well. She shared her own stories about shame that she carried and her own fears of being vulnerable with others. And then she shared how her research showed that our feelings and stories of shame influence how we disconnect or connect with others in our lives. For most of us, human connection is what gives us purpose and meaning in our lives. I would argue for me, that is the holy part of being human. For me, that connection of love is how I experience God or the divine in my life. The Bible claims that God is love. And that simple verse rings true for me more than any other definitions of God that I have ever read. But shame from our past, shame from mistakes, shame taught at our parents' knees digs down deep into our being. And it can create cracks and create a disconnect between ourselves and others. So to stay safe, we learn to hold back. We disconnect. We don't let others look behind our facade to see our real self all the time. Through countless interviews and research, Brene Brown created a definition of shame as a sense of feeling unworthy of love and belonging. She says, shame's the thing that keeps us from trying something new. It's the gremlin at the door that says, no, you can't. You're not good enough. I know your story. I know how you grew up. Who do you think you are? Have you ever heard that gremlin? It can be a loud and persistent beast. I've realized over time, now that I'm a full-on adult, that although those lessons of shame were taught to me at a young age, I'm the only one saying them to me now. That was a wild realization. I'm the only one saying them to me now. If we can quiet that voice down and look around, we see it's really just us. The only real critic in the room is ourselves as we stand atop messages that no longer serve us. What holds shame firmly in place is our fear of being vulnerable. It feels too scary, and many of us rationalize that it's better to hide ourselves than risk being rejected. How many of you here were raised to believe that being vulnerable was an act of weakness, a bad thing? I think most of us were. How many of us try hard to keep that side of ourselves hidden? I think many of us know that feeling of being vulnerable. Our stomach gets queasy and unsteady, our mouths grow dry. We're not sure what to say or do, and it feels dangerous and risky. And our culture tells us to be vulnerable in our workplace or in school or in our relationships. Well, that's just a sign of weakness. Yet Brene Brown says, wait a minute, step back and think about a time when you saw someone who allowed the spotlight of vulnerability to shine on them, and they took an emotional risk and shared a difficult truth. Think about a time when someone very boldly showed you who they really were. We've all experienced moments like that. I ran into a friend of mine at the store the other day. She's in a dining group that I go out with once a month, and I've known her for years, but truth be told, I don't really know her. I mean, I could tell you a lot about her, but we don't hang outside of this group with one another. But I like her. She's sweet and she's funny. As we crossed paths at the store, I greeted her and gave her a hug, and suddenly she blurted out that she has cancer. I could see the fear in her eyes and the uncertainty of it all. And I held her hand as she told me about her doctors and what they plan to do for her treatment. She's a little younger than I am. And my heart was crumbling as she shared this news. How unfair, I thought. Cancer is that big, scary monster that we all fear. We talked for a while, and I promised to check in on her in a few weeks. Later, I brought her a meal, and we talked some more. And for one of the first times ever, we talked really deeply. She shared her fears. I listened and offered what I could. Somehow, within all of our honesty about fears and doubts and worries, I shared that I struggle with anxiety. I have for years. Sometimes I benefit from therapy and medication, and sometimes I struggle through on my own. Her jaw dropped, and she said, I didn't know that. I would never have guessed in a million years that you struggle with anxiety. You always seem like you have it all together. Ah! Seems like being the magic words. I've spent years trying to hide my anxiety from the rest of the world. In fact, it took me a long time to even name it and hold it as truth. I was ashamed. I thought it held me back. I thought it made me different from everyone else who seemed to just go through life with much more confidence and ease. And then suddenly she confessed that she struggles with anxiety too. Ever since she was a teenager, she shared that her mother would always ask her, "Why are you so nervous all the time?" And she said, "I could never figure it out. She just was." She too gets therapy and takes medication. And in that moment, our confessions with one another about something that we had been hiding from others for so very long had now become an invitation to understanding each other better, an invitation to say, "I get it. I know what you're talking about." An invitation to realize that we were not alone. In that moment, I understood what Uriah meant in our reading earlier. He said he wanted to know if you've touched the center of your sorrow, if you've been opened up by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed up by the fear of further pain. He said, "I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it, to minimize it, or fix it." My friend and I knew we couldn't fix this, but we also understood that we could sit with one another in our struggle. This month, we explore the theme of invitation and truth. And the truth that I've discovered in the last 8 years in my life is that when I'm willing to be vulnerable and share my real self with others, it always becomes an invitation, and an invitation for them to share their real self with me. And the facades fall away. And suddenly we are fully ourselves. And I'm not the only one who's seen this happen. I think about Simone Biles, who stepped away from her sport due to mental health issues and took time to care for herself. Her very public decision had some folks criticizing her and calling her weak and telling her she needed to rise above her struggles. But she knew better. She believed in herself and what she needed. And she clearly roared back in full health in the Olympics in Paris this past summer. Her willingness to be vulnerable about her mental health will now serve others who have watched her and saw that it did not destroy her career, but it made her even more of a role model, especially to the young girls and women athletes who are pressured by the demands of their sport. I think of Michael J. Fox, who has turned his struggle with Parkinson's into an opportunity for education, funding, and research. I admit it feels difficult to watch him when he shows us what his Parkinson's really looks like, when he can't control his movements. But he does it to be true to who he is and to show us that he is more than his disease. I think of the great Joni Mitchell, who returned to performing, still showing the physical challenges and changes in her voice and body from a brain aneurysm that she had 5 years ago. And yet we were thrilled to hear her voice again. We were spellbound by her strength, and her music was made more beautiful by how honestly she shared herself with us. I think of Tim Walsh's son, Gus, who lives with neurodivergence, who stood up visibly crying as his dad stood on stage accepting the Democratic nomination for vice president. A young man crying with love and pride for his father should not be shamed, no matter if he's neurodivergent or not. Love and pride are wonderful and expansive emotions. Tears are what happens when we hold more emotions than we can process. To show that openly was an act of courage and love. And the truth is, for all of these people, those moments of raw honesty when they pulled back the deceptive curtain of Hollywood or their fame, we saw them. We really saw them. Bruised, unsteady, but still beautiful and strong. We didn't see it as weakness at all, but absolute courage. And you and I, we're surrounded by people in our own lives who do brave and vulnerable things every single day. I facilitated a group of family members who cared for their loved ones who had dementia at their homes. The honesty in which they shared their frustration and exhaustion was so brave and courageous. The group was a safe place where they could say things out loud. Something like, I just wish my mother would die and that her suffering would be over. And the others understood completely and compassionately held their hands. I think of new parents who feel lost in the darkness of sleepless nights and newborn demands that seem to go on endlessly. I think of friends crippled by the loss of their partner and their need just to be held in their pain. I think of us who maybe only can shovel the walks or bring a meal and sit by their side. Sometimes that feels like all we can do. But in those stories, there is such an underlying sweetness, a window into the complexities of being human, and then also, I think, a sacred honor to be invited in to witness their vulnerability. We've had it all wrong. Being vulnerable is not weak at all, but pure courage and strength. So many of us were baptized in the faith tradition that told us to hide our weaknesses, to pretend to be something we were not, to keep the real parts of ourselves hidden. But if we're honest, the truth is that only disconnects us. That only strengthens our shame. Now, I believe there's a caveat here. I don't think we should run all over Fond du Lac telling everybody our business, sharing our struggles with the strangers on the bus, or confessing to our dentist or the dry cleaner. Do not become that person. But we all have a circle of loving around us. Folks who have earned the right to hear our fears and confessions. Maybe it's a dear friend, a close neighbor, a partner, or a beloved family member. Maybe a therapist. Maybe it's friends here at this fellowship. Maybe it's someone you have also earned the right to hear their truths. We know who we can trust. And here's the thing, even our trusted circle of beloveds need to see us at our worst, to see us struggle, to see us in need, so that they too can feel welcomed to show those things to us. That's an important thing in a relationship. Like I said, I struggle with anxiety. It's usually pretty manageable, but sometimes it literally shouts my name and tackles me to the ground. I seek help during those times, but I used to hide it. When my anxiety acted up, my pattern was just to reinforce my facade with more nails and more boards and maybe even put up a fresh coat of paint. But eventually that wasn't working either. And it was then when I decided to take a different tact. I decided I needed to tell people that this is a part of me. Anxiety is a river that runs through my life. I'm doing okay. But the amazing thing in my telling is that I've had so many other people tell me their mental health struggles too. And best of all, our shame. Our shame evaporates like an unwanted ghost in our telling. Brené Brown says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. Shining light on our darkness with others we trust is a tool of connection. I know if you've paid any attention to the messages I share when I come to speak with you, that I've said some of these words before. This month's theme of invitation makes it easy to return to a repeated message, but an essential message. While writing these ideas into new words, I knew I needed to say them again, and I knew that many of you needed to hear it. I believe we need to hear this message about the courage it takes to be vulnerable on a regular basis, because the Greek chorus of our society constantly sings to us that we are not enough. But the truth is, you are enough. I know that feels kind of cliche in our comfortable lives. We see it in daily affirmation books or on a greeting card, or your yoga teacher smiles and tells the whole class that they are enough. But many of us, myself included, battle with accepting that as a core truth. Its simplicity can be hard to believe. But I swear that you are. You are enough, just as you are, right here, right now, with yesterday's soup stain on your jeans, with your hair sticking up funny in the back, with the weight that you are right now, with wrinkles that crease around your mouth and eyes as you smile, with the exact amount of money that you have in your bank account right now. You are beautiful, bruised, hurting, unique, and divine. And there it is, the core of my good news. Let's lose this religion of believing that vulnerability is too transparent a coat to wear in front of others, a coat that scratches our neck and buttons up too tightly. Let's open our hearts and share our struggles with those who have earned the right to hold our stories. But let's make new coats, ones with stretchy fabrics and down filling and satin lapels. Let's choose to see vulnerability as an invitation with our circle of caring. And let's let go of the shackles of shame that keep us from hiding with one another. Let's accept that, yes, we are brilliant facets of the divine, just as we are. May it be so, and amen.